everybody to our session on pesticide use. My name is Mike Clare. I am the Associate Director for Public Policy at the Harris Center here at Memorial University. Very happy to be your host here this morning. Welcome to those of you who are here with me in the McCann Center. Can I ask you to close that door because I need to be disturbing people in the library. I'm delighted to be your host here this morning. To those of you who are here with me in the McCann Center in the Education Building, welcome. And for those of you who are watching on the internet, welcome to you as well, and especially welcome to our group who is at the Greenville campus, Bob Diamond, etc. Welcome, everybody. So we're talking about pesticides, but let me start by talking about salt. Salt is a great thing. It makes our food taste good, helps us preserve food without refrigeration, done some wonderful things, helps us keeps us alive, actually. But too much of it has been associated with hypertension, strokes, stomach cancer, etc. Same with sugar. Sugar is great, makes our food taste good, adds a little enjoyment to our life. But too much of it creates obesity and all of the problems that obesity brings. So sometimes too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And is that the case with pesticides? We need only watch the news these days to see the value of pesticides in controlling the Zika virus. And as well, over the past several decades, pesticides have proven effective in raising agricultural productivity by the order of magnitudes. But we've also seen the ravages that overuse of pesticides can cause. Overuse of DDT in the 1960s and 70s led to massive collateral damage to birds and beneficial insects. And recent research on neonicotinoids seems to point to harmful impacts on bees and other beneficial insects. So, have we reached the point of overuse of pesticides in our society? What is the evidence for this and what are the impacts? If we are overusing pesticides, what alternatives exist to control pests? And what are the implications for policymakers, regulators, the agricultural and horticultural sectors, university researchers, consumers, and others? So these are some of the questions that we will attempt to address here today. It's a huge topic. We won't resolve it, but we'll at least talk about it. Because the issue of pesticides involves the health of citizens and the livelihoods of many workers, there's been a lot of emotion surrounding discussions on this issue. And this is normal. Emotions are great. They help bring attention to a problem. But they are a poor instrument for finding solutions to problems. And what we need today are solutions. And that only comes from clear-eyed observation, research, discovery, discussion, and negotiation. Or as I like to say, where are the grown-ups? Grown-ups need to be talking. So I invite everyone present today to come to this discussion in the spirit of finding workable solutions to this important issue. And to help guide our discussion today, we have three eminent scholars and practitioners who have studied pesticides and who will share their findings with us. But before I introduce our speakers, let me quickly outline the order of proceedings and give a few housekeeping things, if you don't mind. So our event today will consist of presentations that will last about 45 minutes, and the rest of the time until 1:30 will be taken up with a discussion with you, the audience. And so if you're with me here in the room, just raise your hand. I'll keep tabs in the order of speakers. And if you are watching on the internet, you will see a text box somewhere on the Blue Jeans software where you can submit a question or a comment, and either John or Caitlin here in the room will read it out for us. I invite you to keep your questions and comments short and to the point. And I also invite the presenters to keep their answers short and to the point so that we can entertain as many questions and comments as possible. We're going to be recording this event today, so you can refer to it again later on. It's going to be uploaded to the Harris Center's website, and we usually do that pretty quickly within a day or so. So feel free to come to our website and watch it after. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have a cell phone, I would ask you to put it to the silent mode. For people in this room, the washrooms are located outside the library. Go all the way outside the library. Men's to the right and women's to the left. Emergency exits. In the unlikely event of an emergency, you could go out the same way that you came in, or you can go out that door and turn left. There's an exit there. I am going to circulate a sign-in sheet. We need this for our finance and admin people, just to prove that you were indeed here to eat our sandwiches. So if you haven't signed it, please sign it. Pass that along. I'm sure our guests won't mind if you get up and get a coffee, you get another sandwich, whatever. We got lots of food left over, just as well not to have food left over. So please help yourself at any time. I'm sure we won't. Our speakers won't mind. And in the break between the presentations and questions is also a good time to refresh your food and drink. Are we circulating presentations after the okay to circulate your presentation? Okay. So just so that you don't have to take too many notes, we will be circulating the presentations afterwards. But take the notes that you need to as you go along. So is that good? Sounds like the session that you signed up for? So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And to save time, I'll do it all three at once in the order in which they will be speaking. Dr. Warren Bell has a long-standing interest in health, healing, and disease. He is a family physician and past founding president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. He has served in the past as president of the medical staff at the Shuswap Lake General Hospital in Salmon Arm, BC. As president of Physicians for Global Survival and president of the Association of Complementary and Integrative Physicians of BC. Throughout his 4 decades of clinical work, he has embraced all aspects of the life experience, from attending childbirth through to palliative care, and on to ecologically based medicine. His holistic approach has led him to take a critical look at how we address health and disease. He's written extensively for the online National Observer on a wide variety of subjects of public interest. Dr. Bell is joining us by video conference from BC, where it is currently 7:30 a.m. So we'll go easy on him. And Warren, if you can hear me, thank you very much for taking the time to join us so early in the morning. Dr. Cora Young is an environmental chemist and an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry at Memorial University. She completed her doctorate at the University of Toronto and did postdoctoral studies at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at the University of Colorado. Dr. Young has expertise in the fate and transport of persistent organic pollutants. She and her group have developed new analytical methods for detection of these compounds in the environment, including in the atmosphere, in water, and in biota. And our third and final speaker is Dr. Atanu Sarkar, is a public health physician teaching at the Division of Community Health and Humanities in the Faculty of Medicine at Memorial University. He trained in medicine in India and was awarded all his major public health degrees in that country. Dr. Sarkar worked with the United Nations for several years in India and in Africa. Studied environmental science at Queen's University in Kingston before coming to Memorial University. He has been involved in water-related research for nearly 2 decades, including in this province. So please welcome our panel, and please welcome Dr. Bell to the podium.
Warren is having trouble connecting at the moment, actually.
Oh, okay.
He's there trying, knocking it in, and it's...
Can you hear us?
He can.
You can? Okay. So maybe, Cora, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll...
Actually, one other technical issue on the fly. We got to shift this back over to here. The microphone up there. It's we're not getting great sound.
Okay.
All right. I think that's why they have it on this side of the room.
Okay. So let's push it over to the side so these guys can see. Oh. So if he's there, Cora, maybe we can bring. Is he there, John?
See his name. Growing pains.
I think it might be better if he was first.
I thought I was going first.
Yes, yeah, well, actually, if you... Oh, were you?
I thought I was going first.
Oh, okay, come in. It's my
It's
mistake.
fine.
Yeah, okay, Cora's got to go first.
I don't know. Maybe we've got our wires crossed somewhere.
Is there any microphone? Okay.
No, it's going to pick up.
I can talk loud. I'm fine. I lecture a lot, so I'm used to talking loud. Okay, so thank you, Mike, for the introduction. As Mike mentioned, I'm an environmental chemist, so I work a lot at understanding how pollutants act in the environment. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens to pesticides when they get into the environment and how we can understand some of those processes. So since I'm a chemist, I couldn't get away from showing you a few chemical structures. But what I want you to take away from this is really the diversity of structures that are present in what we call pesticides. And this is partly because we're not looking at a group of structures as in they have structural similarity. We're looking at this group as a common use group. So it's really for our use as humans that we consider these as a single group. So pesticides are used to manage insects, and we call these insecticides. So here we have Mirex. This is a legacy organochlorine pesticide. It was banned in the 1970s. Many of you are probably familiar with DDT, also banned in the 1970s in the US, and now banned through the Stockholm Convention for Persistent Organic Pollutants, but it is still allowed for use in control of malaria. This is a current use pesticide. It's a neonicotinoid, and I find this word hard to pronounce too. So, and I'm a chemist, so imidacloprid. It's a mouthful, and we'll hear a lot about neonicotinoids today. We also use pesticides to control weeds. These are our herbicides. So atrazine is a very common one, still in use today and controversial. Trifluralin is in use today. It has been banned by the EU. And one that we'll hear a lot about today too is glyphosate, better known as Roundup. We also use pesticides to control fungi. So this is a current use fungicide, chlorothalonil. So as you can see, the structures are very diverse. You wouldn't guess that these are all considered from the same class of compounds. And so we have a lot of different things to consider when we're looking at how pesticides behave in the environment. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit about their fate, just from their physical properties. So when we use pesticides, we try to be responsible and use them only in the locations where we want to use them, but they rarely stay where we want them to. They don't behave, we can't tell them what to do very well. And we actually find pesticides all over the world in locations where we might not expect to find them. So what can happen is if we apply our pesticides, so let's say these are our herbicides, we're applying them at the side of a road trying to control brush, based on the different properties, they can move into different parts of the environment. So they can partition into the air, we'll call these hoppers. They can remain in the soil or accumulate into biota, and we'll call these accumulators. Or they can partition into the water, and we'll call those the swimmers. So by moving in these different phases of the environment, we can actually have contamination of the entire globe. So probably the most famous mechanism for how these compounds get transported around the world is known as the Grasshopper Effect. So basically what's happening here is we apply our pesticide to our cornfields in Iowa or wherever they happen to be used. When summer comes, it gets really warm, and that pesticide, oh no, I lost something. Okay, the little orange thing is supposed to move too. I think I messed it up here. So what's happening is our pesticide is following these arrows, and as the temperature changes, it goes up and comes down until it finally deposits in the Arctic. And once it's in the Arctic, it doesn't move again, even when summer comes, because it gets so cold that nothing really happens. So this is known as the Grasshopper Effect. It takes these compounds that we apply at low latitudes and takes them and deposits them effectively permanently into high latitude locations, so the polar regions. And we can see these if we go to the Arctic, which I actually did during my doctoral work. So we can measure these in remote regions, such as the Arctic, which is a big concern because this is really far from where you'd expect any pesticide to be used. There's no insects there are no plants, there's nothing to control. There's just ice. So what we did was we dug a hole in the ice cap. This is the Devon ice cap, which is in the Canadian high Arctic. It's in the Arctic archipelago. So we dug a hole here, and we took samples from the side of this snow pit, and what we were doing was we're going to analyze these for organic contaminants and understand how these deposit to the Arctic. And so others took these samples and analyzed them for pesticides. I was looking at other compounds at that time. But what they found were 9 current use pesticides. So these are all the compounds that they actually looked for in this analysis. And here I'm showing the data for trifluralin. So you see that there's a deposition every year, which varies by year, but every year these are being deposited and into the Arctic and accumulating there. So furthermore, these organochlorine pesticides, so our DDTs and Mirexes, these legacy pesticides, can still be detected in air samples. So if you go to Greenland, which these researchers did by Bossi et al., they took samples, this was in 2012, I believe, they published in 2013, and they were still detecting these compounds in air, even though they've been banned for decades. Okay, so now onto our accumulators. So these compounds, our accumulators, can absorb to soil particles, and these soil particles can actually move into water. So they can be suspended and move into our waterways. So once they're in water, they can either move into the water just by themselves, and what's quite common is that they get consumed by an organism. And once the organism has consumed them, the chemical gets taken up into the tissues of that organism and remains there. And of course, we can have a bigger fish eating our smaller fish, and this big fish that eats lots of these contaminated small fish is going to end up with a higher concentration of these compounds in their tissues. So we call this process biomagnification. As you go up the food chain, the organisms have more and more of these chemicals in their tissues. And this can also lead to transport. So these organisms, they move around in the environment. Fish and birds in particular can carry these compounds really far from their source origin. So we can end up, when they die, with contamination really quite far from where the chemicals were used in the first place. So swimmers are something that we typically haven't considered for pesticides. This is pretty uncommon, but it's pretty intuitive how this might happen. You have a water-soluble compound, it rains, it ends up in our water bodies in the province and then moves to the ocean. And by design, most pesticides wouldn't fall into the category of swimmers. They're not water-soluble, and that's by design so that they work better for their application, which is killing our pests or getting rid of our pests. A notable exception to this is glyphosate. So our Roundup. Roundup is extremely water-soluble. Its water solubility is above 10 grams per liter, so this is millions of times more soluble than the classic legacy organic pesticides. So glyphosate is often detected in surface water and also in seawater, shown a few places where it has been measured. And actually, it's because it's so water-soluble, it's a little bit difficult to use. So my father-in-law is a farmer in southern Ontario, and he applies glyphosate to his crops, as do most of people in that region. And in order to use it effectively, he has to find 4 dry days in a row. So he has to apply it, and then it has to not rain for 3 days after that in order to get the maximum efficacy of this compound. Otherwise, it's going to wash away and not do any good to his crops. So this is actually a unique compound in pesticides and something that we have to consider. So something we'll hear a lot about today as well is toxicity. It's a common issue that these compounds can have effects on non-target organisms. So our target organisms are beetles, or mosquitoes, whatever, or weeds. They're who we want to be targeting, but sometimes we have unintended effects. So we're going to hear a lot about the neonicotinoids from the speakers coming after me. They can certainly have effects on bees and other pollinators, and this is an unintended exposure for these organisms. So neonicotinoids are insecticides. They're meant to be effective on insects, and it turns out they're effective on these compounds, or on these organisms, even when they're exposed unintentionally. You can also have pesticides work in totally different ways. So atrazine, which is a herbicide, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of evidence showing impacts on frogs. So in particular, there's been a lot of data showing feminization of these frogs by atrazine, which is of course totally different from their intended mode of action, which is to act on plants. And all of these, of course, are controversial, and we'll hear more about that because we have our academic researchers doing this type of work, and and sometimes, especially the most outspoken ones, can get into some serious conflict with the chemical companies who produce these compounds. So something that I work on a lot as a chemist is understanding how pesticides change in the environment. So legacy pesticides, so our DDT and Mirex, these compounds are still found in the environment because they have really, really long environmental lifetimes. They don't degrade in the environment. And obviously we decided that was not ideal. So when chemists were designing new pesticides, they tried to make them have shorter lifetimes in the environment. So in theory, then they would have a lesser impact on the environment, which in theory works, but perhaps not so much in practice. So we have our compounds, our pesticides. They can absorb sunlight and react to form different compounds, or they can react with other compounds that have absorbed light and react and form new compounds. They can also react with water and form different compounds. This process is called hydrolysis. And they can also be metabolized by biota or undergo biotransformation. So we started with these 3 chemicals, and we ended up with now 9. And so a lot of what happens when we do environmental regulations, or when the government regulates chemicals, is they only look at these ones. So once these are degraded, it's, as far as the government's concerned, it's gone. But we still have all of these different chemicals that have been produced, and we don't really know anything about them, nor are they regulated. And in some cases, the products, these degradation products, can have similar or greater toxicity than the compounds, the original parent compounds themselves. So the types of data that companies are required to submit to governments before they're regulated is actually quite substantial. There are a number of tests that they have to perform, and they're very strictly regulated, the tests themselves. And they have to submit all of this data to the government before the compounds can be considered for market. And so I took all this data from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is a very rigorous marketer or regulator of these compounds. So they're required to submit physical properties. That tells us whether they're hoppers, swimmers, or accumulators. They have to submit environmental fate data. This tells us how fast or how readily they degrade in the environment. And they have to do toxicity tests for certain species. Of course, they can't do toxicity tests on all species. That would be prohibitively expensive and problematic. But obviously, this is a limitation of the tests. So there's a large amount of useful data that is typically not required. And it relates back to what I was just talking about, those products of environmental degradation. That information is not required. And what happens to those degradation products, their toxicity, totally unknown. So I could spend my life doing these experiments, my career, and we would find all kinds of things that were not required before the compounds were regulated for use in the market. Another thing that's very rarely tested and can cause serious problems in the environment is the toxicity of a mixture. So a real frog in the environment isn't just going to be exposed to atrazine at low levels. It's going to be exposed to atrazine, glyphosate, all kinds of different things that might be used in the environment. And we don't know hardly anything about how toxicity works when you have different compounds together in a mixture. And so I would argue that even with the very best lab data, even with all this excellent data, predicting the full extent of pesticide impacts in the environment is virtually impossible. Okay, so I just wanted to close by talking a little bit about pesticide use in Newfoundland and Labrador. I've heard people have told me Newfoundlanders are very happy that we have such a pristine environment, which is true, and it has been largely unaffected by pesticides, but this isn't because we have excellent environmental regulations. This is really because we didn't have any agriculture. So it's not that our regulations are better than the ones in Ontario where there's lots of farming. That's just not the case. And in recent years, there's been a lot of use of herbicides to control growth around highways, power lines, that kind of thing. And there's this, I find, a mentality that this is the easiest way. We're going to use herbicides. It's going to be great. An example of this mentality, when I bought my house a few years ago, the previous owners had just left the yard a total state. So I called in a consultant to say, like, what should we do about this? And his solution was to use Roundup. Just round up the whole yard, and then you can start from scratch. And that was my reaction. And what we ended up doing was...
Did he know that you were from chemistry?
Yeah, he didn't know I was an environmental chemist. I didn't tell him that. What we ended up doing was actually just mechanically removing the weeds. So my husband was a farmer. He's like, we're not using pesticides. I'm just going to dig all this stuff out. And it worked completely fine. So there's I think an attitude that manual labor is not an acceptable way to remove weeds, and it definitely is. So I really think that in order to maintain the pristine nature of this province, and especially also to preserve our key resource industries such as the fisheries and forestry, we really need to make sure we limit pesticide use to essential applications and not just be. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Remember who was next, Cora? Is it Atanu or Warren?
I think Warren.
Warren, okay.
There's one here. Harris there?
Yes. I'm right here.
Excellent. I think you were up.
Yeah. Yeah, I've solved my numerical problem at this end. I'm now fully linked up as far as I know.
Excellent. We can hear you good on this end.
All right.
If you want to get your presentation up, you're ready to go.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm dialing in from the cloudy province of British Columbia and very happy to be here. I'll just plunge straight in because I know time is of the essence. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about the regulatory process and some of the medical stuff to do with pesticides. I've been involved with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment for nearly 20 years. We started about 20 years ago. So I looked up the Harris Center's position on things and background and found that, of course, there's a vision for the center and there's a mission. And the vision is centered around this notion, which to me as a citizen activist as well as a physician is a very admirable goal, to engage people in the process of understanding what policies are all about. And secondly, to develop policies. And so I'm delighted to be part of this presentation because it's really a goal that is entirely laudable and useful as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to talk about three main players in the pesticide world. Player number three is groups like the one that I just told you about, which is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. We do certain things. We have certain goals. This is off our website, which you can go to. First, we try to understand what's going on with respect to environmental change and its effect on human health. Then we try to educate not only ourselves, but other people, such as the people who are gathered listening to this presentation. We then, because we're an advocacy group, we try to actually do something, which is an important step. It's all very well to understand things, but actually to take action is sometimes the necessary next step. And finally, we don't try to do everything on our own. We work closely with groups at all levels, from local neighborhoods right up to internationally. Now, we've engaged in the issue of pesticides on a number of occasions. This is a poster from our campaign to restrict cosmetic pesticides in Ontario. You see all the other groups that we worked with down at the bottom of the poster. This is a poster from BC, where we had a similar campaign, which was notoriously unsuccessful thanks to a somewhat recalcitrant government, even though the premier before being elected said she was going to institute a ban on pesticides, cosmetic pesticides. Finally, this is a more recent one with respect to neonicotinoid pesticides, which Cora has just referred to. I'll show you some evidence about what they actually do later. Our budget is about $150,000, so we're number three because we're financially less powerful. Player number two is the government at various levels. On the federal level, which is where I'm going to address mostly, there is the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which is part of Health Canada. Now, it wasn't always part of Health Canada. It wasn't always Pest Management Regulatory Agency, or the PMRA, but it is now. And so it's essentially focused around human health, ostensibly. And you'll see here, this is just a kind of a blurb from the beginning of their website, and you can see words like stringently, minimal risk, stringent, science-based, et cetera, et cetera. The impression you get from this is that the job is being done, and is being done on a very effective basis. And as you'll see in a moment, that isn't exactly how it works. The budget for the PMRA is approximately $50 million. So they're coming up a little bit in the financial hierarchy. But player number one is these folks. I gave them a little bit of extra puff because they are really the dominant player in this area. The lobby group in Canada for the pesticide industry is called CropLife Canada. Every year they put out a report on what they're up to, and there are some notorious omissions there, which I'll mention in a moment. They don't mention financial data. They join or create organizations like this one, Honeybee Health Coalition, which are essentially lobby groups for, oh, that's interesting, lobby groups for their point of view. They're a business organization. They're not into health or looking after honeybees. And they make it clear, in case you have any doubts, that pesticides are good things. I added the pesticides, no pesticides captions, but the pictures are pretty eloquent. If you see a picture like that, which are you going to go for, pesticides or no pesticides? If you like tomatoes, it's a pretty obvious thing. As I said, there's no financial information in their annual report, so you have to kind of extrapolate from some of the figures they give about their product sales. And who's selling the products? Well, there's just about every large multinational corporation to do with chemicals and chemical science in the world. Monsanto in the bottom left corner, DuPont, Dow. I'm just wandering off my cursor. Pioneer, Syngenta. These are the big players for sure. So their sales give you an idea of how much what their funding is like. What they call crop protection products are pesticides, 2.3 billion, seeds, which are in this case, when they say seeds with novel traits, they mean genetically engineered seeds, just under 2 billion. So this is a very big player, and that's why it gets the #1 spot. And what they do is regularly play a role in trying to influence government policy. When Ontario announced it was going to reduce the use of neonicotinoids, they were furious, of course, and said, the initial part of this paragraph says, CropLife Canada, along with its members and other stakeholders, continue to advocate for science-based regulations. Well, science-based regulations depends on whose science you use, and you'll see in a moment why that isn't always the same depending on the source it comes from. But anyway, they were very upset about neonicotinoid restrictions. So now, using the magic of digital telecommunications, we're going to, John is going to run a video that has Canada's Environmental Commissioner for Environment Sustainability, Julie Gelfand, tell us a few things about what she found when she recently completed, you'll see the date at the bottom, January the 26th, recently completed an analysis of what the PMRA actually does. So, John, I'm just going to, so you can see the image. And will you run it now from your end? Will you run yours from your end, John? Now I've lost the sound from your end for some reason.
Or the environment.
There
In
we
the
are.
period of our audit, the agency completed some 14 reevaluations.
Okay.
Everyone in the room here heard it, but no one else could.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Julie Gelfand, and I'm Canada's Federal Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. Our audit of the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which registers pesticide products for use in Canada, examined how the agency has managed selected aspects of its mandate. There are currently about 7,000 pesticides containing some 600 active ingredients available in the Canadian marketplace. The Pest Management Regulatory Agency is required to reevaluate the safety of registered pesticides every 15 years. 95% of the agency's reevaluations result in new measures to protect human health or the environment.
Okay, we'll pause right there. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. What Julie Gelfand says is that every time they look at a pesticide, they find more problems with it. And Cora referred to some of the research that actually isn't done and also the research that is done. But even with the limited scope of what the PMRA does, every time they look at a pesticide, 95% of the time, they find worse problems with it. That means that the data that was used to introduce pesticides was radically incomplete. So if we'll go ahead, John.
During the period of our audit, the agency completed some 14 reevaluations per year. At the end of our audit, more than 6 times that number remained incomplete. With more reevaluations due to start each year, the agency needs to quicken its pace to prevent unacceptable risks to people and the environment from the unsafe use of pesticide products.
So, thank you, John. What you see there, or what you hear there, is that the process of evaluation is basically a drop in the ocean. The amount of work that the PMRA does with its extraordinarily slow pace, it's what I would consider obvious foot dragging, is astonishingly inadequate. And the idea of this stringent science-based process is really more of a public relations exercise than an actual product of their activities. So moving on.
I am also concerned that it took the agency an average of 5 years and up to 11 years to remove some pesticides from the market when it determined that they posed unacceptable risks for all uses. The Pest Management Regulatory Agency may grant a conditional registration when it finds that it needs more information to confirm its assessment of a product's value and of the risks to human health or the environment.
I think I missed a cue there.
That's okay. We can stop there, John. Conditional registration has some particular qualities. One is that the PMRA does not have to disclose the basis on which it is evaluating the particular pesticide that's on conditional registration. It can keep that information in-house until a final registration is actually put in place. So we can go ahead, John.
During the time that a pesticide is conditionally registered, it can be bought and used, and other products containing the same active ingredient may also be marketed. We found that 9 products remained conditionally registered for more than a decade. 8 of these belong to the neonicotinoid class of pesticides. These products continue to be used extensively in Canada, despite widespread concern that they may pose a threat to bees as well as broader ecosystems.
So look at what's happening here is 8 of the 9 products that are sitting on the shelf in stores all over the country, despite not just growing evidence, but ample evidence of harm to pollinators, not just honeybees, the European honeybee, but also to wild pollinators, including butterflies. These substances have been used on the market for years and years and years under this special provision, which obstructs the public's notion of the grounds on which they have been approved in the first place. And isn't it interesting that 8 of the 9 products on this list that have been out there for a decade are in this class that is highly controversial? We'll go on, John.
Our audit concluded that the Pest Management Regulatory Agency considered health and environmental risks and value in reevaluating pesticides. However, with respect to conditional registrations, reevaluations, special reviews, and cancellations of registrations, we concluded that the agency had not always acted in a timely manner to fulfill its statutory objective of preventing unacceptable risks to the health of Canadians and the environment from the use of pesticides.
Well, you just heard in the measured tones of a senior federal government bureaucrat, a relatively damning condemnation of an agency that is fundamentally responsible for pesticide control and distribution in the country. And that should give everyone pause. This is, having dealt with the PMRA on a number of occasions over the years, I've seen how slow and how resistant the organization is to acting on pesticide review and restriction. So moving ahead, I'll just give you an example of some of things the PMRA actually has done. Cora mentioned about atrazine. Well, atrazine, there's a ton of research showing that it introduces, it's an endocrine disruptor and causes hermaphrodism in particularly amphibians such as frogs. But here's what the PMRA has to say. It does not, in its recent review, which is taking place as we speak, does not pose unacceptable risk to human health and the environment with respect to drinking water. Well, with respect to drinking water, that's only one part of what it does. It isn't just in drinking water. It's sprayed on crops. And in fact, it poses very significant threats to human health and particularly the environment. But that's not how the PMRA looks at it. So let's move on to another current example. We've just talked about it at considerable length, and that is neonicotinoids. And by the way, in case you're wondering what they are, they're nicotine modified. And if anybody in the room thinks that nicotine is good for human or animal health, we'll have a chat after the meeting.
Sorry,
this is.
Do you need to bring up
Sure.
the presentation again? The video knocked off the presentation from this side.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Yes, I guess nobody's seen it from after Julie Gelfand?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, I'm going back. I'll just very quickly go through. Can you see the slides now?
Not yet. Is your screen sharing?
Yeah, they're on the screen.
I know we went through the back into the screen sharing part of the Blue Jeans window, because we were just seeing your video at the moment.
Okay. Julie Gelfand has trapped us. That's what government bureaucrats sometimes do. Their intentions are good. Their intentions are good. Anyway, this is actually another. Yes.
Warren, it's Mike. I'll give you the 5-minute warning.
Sure. Okay, well, I've here. Has that changed anything? Because I can see everybody now in the room. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all there. I can see you now.
And now turn. Yeah, so you turn your screen sharing off. Turn it back on. We should get your presentation back.
There we are. So are we back at the beginning of my slides?
We are, yes.
Okay, well, I'll rush madly through. Just pay no attention to anything. This is life moving at its 21st century speed. I'll nip past Julie. Okay, Julie is now in the past. This is what I was showing. This is the atrazine summary from the PMRA website. No problem, no unacceptable risks. Now we're moving on to neonicotinoids, the tobacco derivative, shall we call it. By the way, if you're an organic farmer, you can't use nicotine from tobacco as a pesticide. It's far too toxic. So here we are. That's our poster that we had. And this is how industry addresses the issue of neonicotinoids. AgWired is a news service that's used by the agribusiness industry. And they've hired ag informatics to identify the benefits of these pesticides. They've hired this company. There's 4 large multinational pesticide manufacturers listed here, have hired ag informatics to do research and then hand it in. So they've hired a agricultural public relations organization. And essentially, one of the people that works for ag informatics made this statement. He said, basically, we just don't have good data on the benefits, how important these pesticides are. No mention of toxicity, no mention of possible human or non-target species impacts, just the benefits. And that essentially sums up how CropLife Canada and the pesticide industry looks at this. As far as they're concerned, they got to be good. There are products. How good are they really? Let's find out all their benefits. Health Canada, through the PMRA, actually found that neonicotinoids, in a study that they were forced to do because farmers contacted them and said, the beekeepers contacted them and said, we're having a massive die-off in southern Ontario. And they found evidence that the dust coming from seeds when they're being planted was actually causing bee mortalities. They actually took individual carcasses of bees, measured to see if the dead ones had were more likely to have neonicotinoids than live bees, which were trapped and killed. And they discovered that the preponderance in the dead bees of neonicotinoid residues was radically greater than it was in the live and healthy bees. And that's what they said. Now, what science says, independent science says, about what neonicotinoids do is radically different from this rosy view presented by the PMRA. And this is one specific study in which put little radio frequency tags, ID tags, were put on individual bees as they flew around. You can guess, these are very small little tags, right? And the bees flew around, and then once they were exposed to this particular thiamethoxam neonicotinoid, they couldn't figure out where they were going anymore. And of course, they zoomed off into some remote part of the forest or the field and died because they couldn't get any food because they couldn't find the hive. So that homing failure was what was found. In this particular study, just done last year in Scotland, it turned out that there was actually evidence of brain dysfunction caused by these particular pesticides, and it resulted in poor performance. Now, these are just two studies. There's many other studies that are very precise and very exact and show direct damage done to honeybee behavior and function and health by these substances. So I'm going to close with glyphosate, which Cora made clear is a very unusual pesticide because it's extraordinarily soluble, and as a result, it's very mobile. And I'll show you how mobile it is. So Roundup is the product that has glyphosate in it, but there's lots of other things in Roundup. Roundup is not only all pervasive in the environment, it's also all pervasive in the retail sector. And here's some of the products that contain it. It's the largest used pesticide. There's different kinds of pesticides, but it's a herbicide, but it's the largest used pesticide in the world. Just under 1 million tons used in 2012, probably getting closer to that now. 65 million hectares. It's a biggie. This is just a graph to show you how its increased use has been a concomitant of the development of genetically engineered food crops, because 90% of the crops planted in the world, around the world, are products that are dependent on the use of glyphosate for their survival. So looking around the room, it's fair to say that most of us have glyphosate in our bodies in a trace residue, and we will probably have more of it unless we start using less glyphosate. This was in Europe, but I think you can extrapolate to the North American continent because there's actually more glyphosate used in North America than there is in Europe. So moving on to the effects of glyphosate on the ecosystem. The PMRA has, as it traditionally has, is a fairly sanguine view of pesticide, this particular pesticide. It won't persist in the environment. Well, it gets everywhere, so that's a very extraordinarily positive statement to make under the circumstances. And it doesn't pose an acceptable risk to the environment. And it specifically mentions amphibians, which are frogs and tadpoles and other little critters that float around in the riparian zone between bodies of water and land. And what, in fact, does it do to amphibians if you're not the PMRA? Well, Rick Relye at the University of Pittsburgh is leading research on pesticides for a decade, and I I've shown here one of his earlier studies. He created little what he called mesocosms. That's a sort of halfway between the microcosm and the macrocosm is a mesocosm, a little environment where he put frogs outdoors, and then he sprayed them with the typical Roundup spray, and he watched what happened. And to his and everyone else's dismay, I hope, within 3 weeks, he killed off nearly 100% of the tadpoles. And when he looked at the young frogs, he managed to knock off in a day 2/3 to more than 3/4 of the frogs, the growing frogs, young frogs. So even though it's a non-target species, it's a whole different phylum. It's you're looking at animals as opposed to plants. Despite what the PMRA says in general terms, this specific study and many others that he's done about 10 or 15 studies since then, have shown the same thing, and that is that Roundup or glyphosate or the full product. And by the way, he found that the surfactant POEA, polyethoxylated taloamine, it used to be called, made the toxicity of Roundup infinitely greater than the toxicity of glyphosate on its own. Mammals, what does glyphosate do to the mammalian part of our biota? Well, there's a paragraph here that I wouldn't suggest you try to read it. There's too many big words in it, but in essence, it says nothing. And so, sorry, we'll get rid of that gentleman for a moment. Let me just read one sentence. The most sensitive endpoints for risk, used for risk assessment include clinical signs of toxicity and developmental effects. There was no indication that the young were more sensitive than the adult animal. Well, that doesn't say what it did. It just said, don't worry, everything's fine. Because the adults and the children are equally or equally not sensitive. Doesn't tell you what it actually did. Well, this guy nearly got lynched because he actually dared to do research. This is a renowned French researcher who has notoriously explored areas that industry is not comfortable with in his research. And he carried out a study, which is this study here, looking at Roundup and Roundup, what's called Roundup Ready or Roundup Tolerant corn, which he called maize, to see what actually happened when you fed it to rats. And he did a very unique study, and that's why it has had an enormous impact, and he nearly got lynched. Here's what he found. First of all, he replicated an experiment that had been done by Monsanto, one of the experiments that was pivotal and was the basis of their obtaining approval for the use of glyphosate when it was first introduced. They did a study for about 6 months, and he extended the study to the full lifetime of the Sprague Dawley rats. Sprague Dawley rats are rats that develop tumors readily when they are exposed to various substances. He wasn't looking for tumors, but that's what those are the rats that were used by Monsanto, so he did the same thing they did. He published the study, but he didn't tell anybody he was doing it until he was ready to publish his results. Now, this caused a little eyebrow raising, but the reason was he knew that industry in the past, anytime studies come out that challenge their product line, he could get hammered. So he waited until he had the results done. What he found was not just increased tumor formation, which is what was found a little bit in the Monsanto study, but he also found widespread kidney damage. If I recall correctly, about 80% of the damage caused by both the corn that had Roundup traces in it and Roundup by itself in the same level of application that would be used in agriculture, caused very severe and widespread kidney damage, including increased mortality rates, much more debility in the rats that were exposed compared to the control group. There was a third group, which was control group. So what happened was the typical response from industry, which has a number of supporters in the scientific community, sort of went nuts, and they even managed to get one of their executives hired on the editorial board of the journal that published the study. And lo and behold, a little while after he published it, just over a year later, the study was withdrawn. That resulted in a backlash from the scientific community, unrelated to the experimental subject, but primarily related to the fact that they said, look, lots of us have done studies where we had inconclusive results. In fact, the authors, Seralini and others, said, we don't have a conclusive result. We want others to replicate the study we did to see if they get the same conclusion. They didn't do anything fraudulent. Their methodology was satisfactory. They just didn't come with a clear-cut result, or they didn't claim a clear-cut result. That was the grounds on which the study was dumped, and the scientific community said half the studies in the literature would be dumped because they were inconclusive. So what happened was the study was republished because of this outcry. Seralini had practically his pick of journals to publish it in, including some very prestigious ones, but he chose a journal that was an open access publication because he wanted everybody to be able to see his results. So it's now out in the literature again. All you have to do is Google Seralini and you'll find it in next to no time. So that's mammals and amphibians. What about you and me? Well, bad news for glyphosate recently. Some of you may recall this. Last March, the IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer, said, we think glyphosate is probably a carcinogen for humans. Needless to say, industry was very upset about that. And the PMRA had a few things to say. It couldn't really say that it isn't a carcinogen. So what it said instead was, okay, fellas, just don't get upset. When they say it's carcinogenic, that doesn't mean that it might be causing cancer in you, because hazard and risk are two different things. Hazard is what it does to you. Risk is how much you have to get into your body before something goes wrong. It sounds like a technical distinction, but in the scientific community, it's a very important one. But basically it said, don't worry, you're okay. You won't get cancer from exposure to glyphosate. Well, that may or may not be true, but there is evidence that it might be true. And this is just one little drama that unfolded far away from our country and from Newfoundland and Labrador as well. Sri Lanka, the government of Sri Lanka saw evidence from its own scientific community that was compelling enough to consider withdrawing its use in the entire country. And you'll notice the date here is March the 13th, 2014. So it's a couple of years ago. And this was published by a journalistic organization called the Center for Public Integrity. They actually went around and asked scientists and looked at the evidence and said, what's going on here? And so this was published, this was done on March the 13th, 2014. And this is why they did it. If you look at the blue line, that's genetically engineered food crops. If you look at the red line, that's the application of glyphosate to these crops, because most of them use glyphosate. And the yellow bars are death rates in the country. And association is not causation, but by golly, this is a pretty interesting association and pretty worrisome association. You'll even notice that the use of glyphosate, there's a couple of blips in the red line, and they correlate with blips in the death rate as well. So what happened on April the 11th, 2014, which is just under a month later? Monsanto applied pressure on the Sri Lankan government. The U.S. government threatened trade sanctions against Sri Lanka. So the U.S. government and Monsanto argued in precisely the same direction, and less than a month after taking this step, the government of Sri Lanka was pressured to reverse its stand and re-permit Roundup to be used widely in the country. And by the way, there was within Sri Lanka, their minister, who is a registrar of pesticides, who was a long time proponent of pesticide use in general. He was their spokesperson for Monsanto and the U.S. government. Anyway, that's what happened to Monsanto's, to Sri Lanka's attempt to get rid of glyphosate. Some other studies I'll just run through. This is one on antibiotic resistance being affected by glyphosate. You know, if you take an antibiotic, will it work to get rid of the infection you have? Well, it might not if you've got glyphosate in you, because the concentrations found were applied to plants and get into residues in food and then get biomagnified in our bodies can actually cause us harm by reducing the ability of antibiotics to affect infecting bacteria in case of human infection. So that's the study. Just close a couple of slides to give you some other images of what goes on the PMRA. 30% of the revenue comes from the industry, and we all know that jingle, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Whether it affects the judgment of people working at PMRA or not, it affects the judgment of doctors. We know this in my profession. If you get money from the drug industry to do a study, the chances of your study being positive go up radically, and if you don't, they go back down. The research that the PMRA looks at comes from industry. They don't have their own research capacity. They have to contract stuff out. And so they're getting sponsored studies. And sponsored studies there's lots of evidence that they tend to slant data in a particular direction to favor the product. As Cora said, full preparations are not looked at, only active ingredients. And by the way, you can't find out what the other ingredients are, because the Canadian government has passed laws to forbid that for commercial secrecy reasons. Products are not tested in combination, and they're not tested against all of the other things that are found in the human bodies. And the Center for Disease Control has found that 40 to 60 chemicals on average are found in the typical human carcass body. So even though the PMRA approves products, as you can see, there are some holes in this process, and provinces and municipalities have the right under the law to enact legislation to protect the health of citizens. So this is for policymakers in the audience today. You know, if you're a provincial or municipal representative, you have the legal right to enact restrictions on pesticide use within your jurisdiction under Canadian law. Final points. I think you get the impression that the regulation process is in many respects weak and tends to favor industry priorities. It's incomplete, and Cora touched on that as well. I would say it's radically incomplete, and just doing study after study is not going to solve the problem. I think we're at the point where the so-called precautionary principle has to start applying. Every time a new study is done, it tends to find new hazards and rarely gets rid of something that we were worried about. It usually finds out that it's worse than we thought. Any new studies have to be independent. Studies that are done that are sponsored by vested interests are just not adequate. Any policymaker who steps in boldly into the realm of pesticide restriction is potentially facing huge pushback from industry advocates, and you have to be prepared for that, because otherwise you might be shocked by how intense it will be. And I could give you some examples later if you're interested. And finally, one way to short circuit some of that resistance is to approach nonprofit advocacy groups in society and enlist their help for supplying you both with independent data and also the kind of grassroots support that makes policy change in real world terms a much more smooth process. And that's what CAPE has done in many occasions, and many other organizations have done as well. Finally, just a little phrase. I think that if the provincial government and other governments in Newfoundland and Labrador use the protection of human and ecosystem health as a fundamental principle, then I think instead of using economic indicators alone, then I think the citizens of your province are going to be very well served by your policy making. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren, and we'll now turn it over to Atanu.
Yeah,
We're ready to go.
thank you. This is the challenge for the last speaker. But it's good that already Cora and Warren has actually taken some of my burden. It is almost most of the issues have been covered. I will just going to quickly run through some slides and raise some of the issues which I think is a very emerging issues and it is worth sharing with you guys. So now, next one, please.
Yeah, actually, there's a more.
Oh, sorry. This one, right?
Yeah.
This one? Okay, so now, before I start with the emerging issues, I just want to tell you that I am actually associated with CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for Environment, when I was studying at Queen's, and I was a group of CAPE students group, and that since then I'm still attached to that. Not very active, but I am always get their CAPE's regular activities, and so I would like to share with what Ontario College of Family Physicians, they did a wonderful systematic review of pesticides, and it's openly available in a website. You can just Google it and get it. It's a very extensive study. I'm just telling you some salient features. Like they talked about how all the existing pesticides and banned pesticides affected the reproductive health, like it affected the fetal growth, low birth weight, preterm birth, congenital anomalies like some problem with male genital systems, neurological defects, congenital diaphragmatic hernias. These are very scary health issues, but there are a lot of evidence showing that how pesticides are linked with health problems. Neurodevelopment also, they found some mental development, psychomotor development, ADHD, low IQ, autism, and also respiratory health outcomes like asthma, chronic bronchitis. So they are old issues. So we all know that, and that doesn't mean that we are getting away of that. Still, there's an issue coming up because still those pesticides are existing in the environment. Now, and already Warren and Cora extensively talked about the health and ecosystem aspect and the whole chemical aspect of pesticides. Now, what are the emerging issues? This is the typical, we always have things, nowadays, this is old cartoon, this, what is it, Lion King, Hakuna Matata, don't worry. What? If it is low dose exposure, if you are exposed to very low dose, you are safe. We are living in a safer place. The pesticides are used in a far off place in agricultural land, we are safe. Or if it is banned, that means you are safe, right? So, but that is not true. I'll give you some recently published article. It is published in 2015 that already we have discussed about the Roundup, and Warren already talked about Seralini study. Seralini is also one of the co-authors of this article. And this article actually says that, we always talk about the safe dose, safety limit is a safe limit. They used a very low dose, ultra low dose of glyphosate on some rats. And for 2 years studied the full life cycle of this rat, and they found even if the ultra low dose, I mean, if you see this, when human being is said 1.75 milligram per kg of body weight, or in the European Union, USA said it is USA said it is 1.75, and EU say 0.3 milligram per kg. It is safe. They use a nanogram per kilogram of body weight. 1 milligram is 1 million nanogram. You can understand. Such a small quantity. Even with such a small dose, they found that they're having the liver and kidney damage of the animal. That means that even it is extremely low dose, don't think that you are safe. So there is no such thing called the safe limit. In fact, that is also applicable for the other chemicals like arsenic and other heavy metals. There is no such thing called safe limit. Even the new studies are coming up now in academic journals that they are doing research. Okay, something like 10 ppb is a safe limit. What happens if people are exposed to 1 ppb or less than 1 ppb? They found even it is such a low dose, even if it's longer duration exposure, it can cause serious health issues in a prolonged time. So the whole concept of safe limit doesn't exist. Then, as already Cora extensively talked about, I mean, she was actively involved in the research, that even the pesticides which are used in different part of the continent, it can found in quite distant place. I mean, it's a study found that flame retardants, organochlorine found in Yukon. They found, in northern Greenland, they found pesticides and other brominated flame retardants. So these all are another example of that no place is safe. And the last one, it is really, I think it's very it's published not very recently, 2013, but it is opening up a new areas of concern, health concern, that if you ban a pesticide, you understand that the pesticide still may remain in the environment because its half-life is low, even it remain in the environment for long. But also it is true that even if you are living away from those pesticides, but if your parents or grandparents are exposed to pesticides and after it was banned, and if you're born after the banning of the pesticide, you are not safe. Not even your kids are safe. Because the genetic defect that happens to your parents or your grandparents, that transfers from generation to generation, that may not exhibit any health issue, that may exhibit maybe your children or grandchildren. And they have done, that is a very excellent study showing that even in rats who are given a pesticide, then after 2 or 3 or 4 generations, they found they are exhibiting the disease. Even then, those generation rats are not exposed to pesticides. And that is another concern, that even DDT is banned. We should not say it problem is over because we only concentrate on the existing pesticides. We'll definitely consider existing pesticide or the pesticides are forthcoming. But also you have to think about who are already banned, because we are not safe. Which are banned 30 years ago, the effects still continue for generation after generation. The takeaway message from this study is that if pesticides are, as Warren nicely mentioned, that what should be the ideal regulatory system. So if you pesticides are marketed, after 5-10 years, all this kind of dilly-dallying and this bureaucracy and the corporate conspiracy, and if it takes time for the banning, don't say that it is done, job's done, because the damage being done during that the period, it is irreparable. The message is you have to be more stringent even before coming to the market. And Warren already talked about the issues with regard to Canadian, the regulatory authorities. People always compare the Europeans that are better than us because they're more environment conscious. That I give you this picture. This EFSA, it is European Food Safety Agency. They said Roundup is non-carcinogenic. You can go ahead. Although a lot of European studies showing that. And scientists say it is probably carcinogenic. Already Warren said that in WHO's Cancer Research Institute in Lyon in France, they said it is probably carcinogenic. So the question is, whom do we believe? So that needs more and more concerned effort of the public policy makers and the scientists and the citizens and the civil society organizations should actually act together to follow the science, not being influenced by the industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atanu, and thank you, Cora and Warren. I think we had 3 great presentations.